So, good morning, everyone. I apologize for the late start as we try to figure out technical issues, but my name is Alvita Otley, and I'm an assistant professor at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm excited to be chairing this session today on workflows and parameters. In the interest of time, I'm just going to hand it over to Curation, and he's going to be presenting the first paper on reusing interactive analysis workflows.
Hi everyone, good morning. Today I'll be presenting our work on reusing interactive analysis workflows. This work was done with Zach Cutler and Alexander Lex, both of whom are here in the audience today. So I would like to start with the two major paradigms of doing data analysis. The first is the interactive visual analysis with tools like Tableau or Power BI, and the second is the computational analysis environment with Jupyter Notebooks or Python code scripts. Interactive visual analysis are usually very intuitive. They leverage the human perceptual capabilities, allow the users to see the data before interacting. However, the analyst needs to redo parts of the analysis when they want to start a new session. Whereas a computational analysis is flexible and it is reusable because you can reuse parts of your code over and over again. But the other side of computational environment is you need programming knowledge to use it effectively, and it might end up being time consuming. Now, certain tasks are easier with an interactive analysis environments. For example, tasks like labeling, aggregation, filtering, or categorization, where you can see the data and play around with it visually, makes it easier to do these tasks. Now, let's take an example of, we have this data set here, and we want to categorize it into 3 categories. In a computational notebook, you will start by writing a query predicate to select a subset of data. Then you would write some code to add a category column to it. And then you repeat this for all different categories you want to add. Whereas depending on how complex your selection predicate is, this might take a while. Now, in an interactive visualization environment, you just have to select using a brush or a paintbrush selection, and then assign the label, and then you repeat this for all different labels you have, all different categories you have. So interactive visualization makes doing tasks like this much easier. Now, the question is, what if we want to reuse our analysis? So in a computational environment, reusing the analysis is essentially as simple as parameterizing our code in a function so that we can call it with all the different data sets, different parameters, etc. But in interactive visualization, we usually have to repeat our analysis again when we have new data set, when we have an updated data set, or when we want to start a new analysis session, even on the same data set. So in this paper, we tried to explore the question, can we make visual analysis reproducible? Now, our primary contribution in this paper is the technique to capture the analysis provenance of a visual analysis session and then curate reusable workflows from this analysis session. Capturing reusable workflows allows us to reapply these workflows on an updated data set, as well as reapply this captured workflow in a different environment, such as a notebook or other computational environment. So let's just start by talking about what is a workflow and how do we create it in different paradigms. So workflow can be simply defined as a sequence of tasks to process the data in a certain way. In a computational environment, it can be something like basically a series of function calls to transform the data. But what about in interactive visualizations? So to create workflows in an interactive visualization, we have 2 broad approaches. The first is the explicit modeling of workflows, and the second is process-based curation of workflows. In explicit modeling, we specify each task individually and then define the sequence in which they will be executed. This approach is very similar to programming, but this approach does require some knowledge of what the workflow is going to be before we start creating the workflow. So it does not support rapid exploration as easily. So good examples of these approaches are Vistrails and Visflow. Vistrails has a visual workflow creation tool for scientific visual analysis, and Visflow has similar tool for tabular data, and it supports all the actions such as adding view specifications, filters, aggregates, etc. The other approach, which is process-based, relies on, in process-based curation, we start by tracking the interactions during an interactive visual analysis session in a provenance graph, and then we take parts of this provenance graph and curate it as a workflow. This approach allows us to explore the data freely before we actually have to think about what workflow do we want to curate. So we can leverage the analysis provenance and then curate an interesting workflow after the fact. An example of this approach is the Vis Stories work by Gratzel and others. So Vis Stories captures the interaction provenance for all the tasks you do, and then uses this interaction provenance to create a story and for presentation purposes later. Vis Stories, however, does not support reusing of the captured provenance on updated dataset or. So we chose process-based approach as a base for our techniques in this paper because it's easy and natural to do exploration first and curate workflows later. And it also allows for free-form exploration of our dataset. So let's start with this simple analysis. This is a simple analysis process here where the analyst first added a scatter plot. Then they use rectangular brushes to select the points which are outliers, and then they filter out their selection. Then they resize the plot since now they don't have outliers to better see the data. Now the analyst decides to curate the first 3 steps, which are adding the plot, selecting the outliers, and filtering out the selected points as a workflow, and they call it a filter outliers workflow. This workflow is great for reproducibility. If they want to start a new session with this dataset, they can reapply these 3 steps again, and they can save time. But what if the dataset changes? Now here we have update to a dataset which adds 3 new points. So if we try to apply this saved workflow directly to the dataset, we see that 2 points here have been missed. Let's zoom in and see. So here we have these 2 new added points, which are technically outliers, but were not actually selected by the workflow. So why does this happen? So these points were missed because the way we capture selections in the provenance itself. So let's look at this simple selection and look at the ways we can store these selections in the provenance graph. The simplest way is just to store the IDs of the selected points. This approach is very straightforward, but this approach basically doesn't support any reusability because it just relies on these points being there. A slightly better approach is to store the rectangular area or like any area which represents these selection, which we did in the previous example. And we see that even this approach does not work great for updates which are outside the range of our selection. So we can actually then store the pattern of the selection itself. For example, this selection we can store as a cluster, a k-means cluster at position 2, 3, and doing so allows us to capture a higher level concept which improves our reproducibility. And further, it also makes our dataset robust to changes. So for example, if a new point was added near this cluster, we could potentially improve our selection and include this point as part of the new selection. In our previous paper, we introduced techniques to capture these patterns behind an analyst interaction I will briefly go over the techniques from this paper and see how they can be applied further. So whenever the analyst does a selection, we compare their selection with output of different machine learning algorithms, each of which represents a pattern in the data. We then rank these outputs of this algorithm as predictions for the analyst to select, and maybe improve on their original selection using one of the predicted patterns. For example, the analyst could say this cluster prediction actually improves on is what I actually originally wanted to do, and then improve their original brush selection using a cluster. They can also annotate this. Semantic selection with some domain knowledge on how it applies. So now let's look at how we can use this technique to capture reusable workflows. Here we again have an example of where the analyst started by adding a scatter plot. Then they selected points using a rectangular brush, but instead of manually selecting all the points, they used algorithmic predictions to improve their selection to say select all the outliers, let's say by a DB scan outlier algorithm. And then they filter out these selections. Now they can curate a semantic filter outlier workflow from this provenance. For example, here they have addition of the scatter plot, or more generally a view specification, selecting the outliers using just the outlier algorithm, and then filtering out the selected outliers. You can notice in this case, you don't actually need to store the manual selection in the semantic workflow itself, because it is replaced by a better selection. Now we have an updated data set here, which has 5 new points added, 3 outliers and 2 inliers. If we apply this semantic workflow to this new data set, we can see it selects the outliers correctly and doesn't affect the inliers. So we implemented a prototype to show our techniques. So here we have an example from our prototype where the analyst starts with a rectangular brush to select a cluster, but then they actually use a cluster prediction from the system to improve on their rectangular brush selection. Now here we have an example of the same data set being updated. So when we see that in this update to the data set, a lot of points in the cluster have moved down along the y-axis. Some points have been added and some points have been removed. The analyst can then see how their original selection would be transferred to this moved cluster, and how their selection and what changes will happen to their original selection. And if they're happy with it, they can reapply their captured selection automatically to this new data set. Now, this automatic application of workflows might not always work successfully. For example, here the analyst used a cluster prediction to select this cluster, but during the dataset update, the cluster might actually break apart, and applying the workflow directly to this broken cluster does not work. So we gave analysts the ability to mark certain points in the captured workflow as incorrect for a particular version of the dataset. So they can review these interactions and then maybe create a new workflow for cases like this. I'd like to switch to a short demo. Hopefully the demo works, else I'll just switch to a video. Okay, so I hope, yeah. Okay, so we have, so I have prepared like a short, we'll walk through the provenance graph to see what we are trying to do here. So we started by specifying a scatter plot. We added a brush, and then we updated the brush to better capture our selection. But then we actually changed our brush selection with a cluster prediction, which captures the cluster semantically. Now let's try to switch to a different data set and see how this cluster is applied. If we switch to different versions of the data set, we can actually see our selections have been transferred. Now now we will filter out our selections. Okay, yeah, so there are issues with the internet, so I think I'll just switch to the video version because it's easier to walk through. Live demos. Okay, so yeah. So yeah, in this case, we filtered out our selection. Once we filter out our selection, we can now curate our provenance session into a workflow. So here we create a new workflow called delete cluster, and we add our entire captured provenance analysis session to the workflow, and then we then we can choose to remove parts of this, part of the provenance session we don't actually need in the workflow. Once we do this, our workflow is saved, and we can now switch to a different version of the dataset. Here we switch to version 5 of the dataset. Like, these versions are just named arbitrarily, but in this version, the cluster actually has moved down. And in the tool, you can now open the workflow manager window and scroll down to find our newly created delete cluster workflow and load it. When we load the workflow, we can see that the workflow has been loaded, and our cluster on the new version of the dataset has also been filtered. We can go back in the provenance to verify that indeed, like, our selection was been transferred to this new workflow, to this new version of the dataset. Our tool supports addition of multiple plots to represent higher dimensions, addition of a parallel coordinate plot, and a lot more interaction. This tool is available for a live demo. I'll share the link at the end, so please feel free to try it out. Now, reusing the workflows on updated data set in the same tool is great, but data analysis rarely takes place within a single tool. Usually, for different steps of the data analysis process, analysts use different tools. And switching between these tools is not trivial. Exporting the transformed data from one tool to other is not always easy. Sometimes the tools don't support the correct export format. Sometimes they don't even support exporting. And in these cases, the analyst has to redo the parts of the analysis in the new tool they are switching to. So another contribution of our paper is then using this captured workflow as a means to switch to a different tool. So for example, here we have a demo. Here we have like a concept for using a workflow in a Jupyter notebook. So here we start with the analysis session. We curate a workflow out of the analysis session. Then we store this workflow to a workflow database. And then a Jupyter notebook imports the workflow, applies the workflow to the dataset, and then you can do your further analysis as usual in a Jupyter notebook. We created a library to show this approach. It's a Python library, and it is published to the Python package index. This library allows us to load the workflows created in the prototype directly. This library actually contains all the core logic for capturing the workflows and applying them semantically. Our library focuses on applying the captured workflows to a pandas data frame, because pandas data frame has a very widely supported API, and it is compatible with a lot of other libraries for data analysis. And this library mainly serves as a proof of concept for similar implementation in other languages like R or SAS, where then potentially these workflows can be used across all these different platforms. So here we'll just walk through a visual demo of how using a workflow in the Jupyter notebook would look like. So we start by importing the library. With the library we can load a particular project. So here we have loaded the COVID dataset, which is available in the live version of the tool. The dataset has been taken from the COVID Our World in Data project. We can list all the workflows for this particular project that are saved to a workflow database. We can then, in the Python environment itself, we can visually look at what the steps in the data, what the steps in the workflows are before we actually apply it. So for example, here the analyst started by selecting all the outliers in the new deaths versus new cases plot. Then they filtered in these outliers and categorized these outlier countries with respect to the number of deaths and number of cases. Now they can choose. At this point, now that they have loaded the workflow, they can choose to apply this workflow in Python to different versions of the COVID dataset. So here we are applying the workflow to January, December, and June datasets. They can plot to see whether their workflow has been applied correctly. This plot here in this case is created with Altair in a Jupyter notebook. Once they get the result in data frame after the application of the workflow, they can do the usual data analysis that we do in Python. For example, here the analyst has, here we have used the newly created categorical column to aggregate, to group by on, and then compare different regions of the different regions with respect to COVID death cases. So to evaluate our techniques, we followed two different approaches. First, we present some usage scenarios with the COVID Our World in Data project and the Gapminder public health dataset for different decades. Both these scenarios are available as live, are available in our paper to read. We also include live links to the actual analysis session in the tool in the paper, so you could just click on that and go to the tool itself. The other thing we did to evaluate our technique was to do an expert feedback session with 4 data practitioners. So we started the session with an interview regarding the existing analysis process of these practitioners, what they do, how frequently they switch between the tools, how often their data sets update. Then we introduced them to the techniques we discuss in this paper. We did a demo using the live prototype and a Google Colab notebook. And then finally, we did a feedback and reflection session on how these techniques can then be applied to the practitioners' own workflows or their own analysis processes. So we had some interesting feedback regarding different aspects of our techniques. So regarding the curation of workflows from provenance rather than specifying workflows directly, when participants said they liked it because this approach feels much more natural. And this was especially true in the case where the participant was not a computer scientist, but like a bioinformatician. Regarding the use of these workflows on updated datasets, one of the participants was really happy about this because their datasets update frequently, but they don't actually change their method of analysis that often. So reapplying parts of their analysis automatically really seems helpful to them. And then about reusing the workflows in the computational environment, the participant, like one of the interviewees, was happy about the fact that they could visually select points and then look at their selections in the code directly. So we see 2 potential future directions to expand this work. First is using workflows as templates. So our technique currently shows how the workflows can be applied to an updated dataset. But if the dataset updates too drastically, let's say it goes from having 100 points to like 100,000 points, or if we want to apply the workflow to a completely unrelated dataset, this is difficult to do with the existing technique directly. So we can expand on the captured workflow by allowing parameterization of the workflows. For example, we can maybe replace the captured outlier detection algorithm with a different one, which is more specific to a different dataset. So doing so will allow us to reapply our workflow on unrelated datasets, and then these templates can be used to automate the repetitive data processing task, which we have to end up doing always. We can also use these workflows created by experts as workflow templates created by experts to train the new analysts. Another direction we can expand this work is integrating the interactive visualizations directly in the computational notebook itself. So we have libraries like Altair which support embedding of interactive visualizations in a notebook. However, these interactions are limited to selections and linking between views. They typically do not allow manipulation of the data frame directly. The B2 paper by Wu and others proposes a technique of using query predicates or selections, more to be precise, as to bridge between these interactive visualizations and the computational cells themselves. However, this technique only supports selections currently and does not capture the interaction provenance. We foresee using the captured semantic workflows and the semantic analysis session as a way to bridge the gap between the embedded interactive visualizations and the computational notebook cells themselves. So I would like to thank you all for attending my talk. You can use the QR code or the URL to go to our project website, which has links to our live version of our tool, some more images. We'd like to thank Derya Agbaba and Jack Wilburn from Visualization Design Lab for help with designing the expert feedback interviews and structuring them, and National Science Foundation for funding our project. I'll be taking questions.
Okay, so we have time for one brief question.
Hi, Stefan de Elze, TU Eindhoven. Very nice work. So I have a question about the generalizability of your method, because all the examples that you show were based on selection, right? But in a typical analysis workflow, you would also apply some analytics, like doing clustering, k-means, or density-based approaches. And then with each update of the data set, you would have different parameters. So I was wondering if you have ideas on how you could extend or use your method to support also this.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. Yes, for generalizability, yes, we chose selections and the interaction and data transformations which occur after selection as a case to show in our implementations, because that is the most common use case. However, as I mentioned, we could potentially expand on this workflow and allow parameterizing the captured workflow, just as you would parameterize a function or your existing code, to allow for applying them to data sets which then change in different ways. So for example, you could have a series of actions stored, and then let's say when a data set changes in a way that requires changing the choice of our clustering algorithm or our outlier detection algorithm, you could just drop in the replacement algorithm and the rest of the workflow should still apply. Yeah, thank you.
Hi,
Hi.
Jean-Daniel Figat from INRIA. So very nice work. I was wondering, so if you look at the world of machine learning, the pipe workflows are pretty well known and they use them all the time, and especially for things like AutoML, where you have dedicated steps in the workflow. Would it make sense for your workflow to be a bit more prescriptive and to tell the users that first there is kind of a data pre-processing step in order to I don't know, scale the data, etc. Then there is another step which can be filtering, selection, etc. in order to avoid redoing all the curation that you're mentioning, but that might be very repetitive and in a sense very mostly the same for most of the operation. Would it make sense to try to structure a bit more the workflows then?
Yeah, again, so one of the future directions, like as I mentioned, like we can use this captured workflows as templates. So for example, let's say we can have an expert data practitioner create a workflow where they do the data pre-processing, and then we can have the new analysts who come. They can use this workflow or the workflow template as the guide for, okay, this is what we have to do first, this is what we have to do next. So the workflows themselves can act as this prescriptive method for guiding the new analysts.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you, Kiran, for such an exciting talk. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but maybe during break.
Happy to talk after.
All right, let's take our speaker.